The effects of war bring a special hell of anger, fear, and night terrors. It takes the special skills honed in the extraordinary situations of war zones to bring reconciliation and forgiveness to those in deep pain. Dr. Eileen BORRIS has been in the front lines of forgiveness since the 1980s. As a political psychologist, Dr. BORRIS helps to rebuild war-torn countries such as Liberia, Nepal, Pakistan, India, Israel, and the occupied territories. Her work focuses on reconciling centuries-old conflicts and finding ways to forgive. She understands the deep-down psychological issues surrounding conflicts and the healing of conflicts. Not only does Dr. BORRIS work in war-torn countries by invitation at the United Nations, she speaks to non-governmental organizations worldwide about forgiveness and reconciliation. She continues to lead the charge by training other high-profile people such as diplomats, peacekeepers, and humanitarian organizations. Dr. BORRIS is a prolific writer, publishing many articles and books on the topic of forgiveness, from the personal to the political. His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote a foreword to both of her books on forgiveness. The books focus on the profound impact of forgiveness on multiple levels, ranging from individuals' personal lives to the resolution of long-standing international conflicts.
Thank you so much. I was hoping that Fred was going to stick around and hold this for me. I'm so honored about it. Dr. Eileen BORRIS is champion of forgiveness. I can't thank you enough. This honor means a great deal to me, not necessarily for my personal recognition, but for what the Worldwide Forgiveness Alliance is doing to bring forth the thinking of forgiveness, which is so critical. If we could only remember to practice forgiveness for those little things. You know, when you're driving down the highway and somebody kind of cuts in front of you and you got a few words you want to say, to kind of maybe think a little bit more about that. Or, you know, those all too familiar arguments you have with your spouse. If we could only stop for a moment and think about what is going on in that person's head, if we can just try to experience that person emotionally, and instead of responding in anger, forgive. Those little things begin to add up. Those little things really make a difference. Everything counts. And when we can begin to do those little things, what begins to happen is that we begin very slowly to have a shift in our own consciousness. And when that happens, we also begin to affect human consciousness. And it's those little steps, one by one, that really begin to count. I've been really passionate about forgiveness for a very, very long time. And people ask me, how did you get involved with this? What made this happen for you? And I don't have a story of forgiveness that transformed me. But I think it began when I was very, very young, as a child. I think the seeds were planted then. For I grew up in a German Jewish family, and in those kinds of circumstances, two things can happen. First, either the family always talks about the Holocaust, or it's never spoken about at all. And in my family, it was pretty silent. But I had an aunt who would tell me about the stories that happened in her family. And I remember thinking as a child that this couldn't happen ever again to anyone. And so I guess it's really no surprise that when I decided on the profession of clinical psychology and political psychology, where it came from, because in my own strange way, I really do want to be in those war zones to help heal the wounds of war so people can stop passing down these angers and hatred, just like Rabbi Lerner was speaking about in that wonderful invocation. We need to stop passing all of this down. And the way we begin is to help people heal from that trauma and hurt and teach them how to forgive. I do believe that we have a very clear purpose in life, and if we could just allow it to unfold, it will take us where we need to go. And so through many strange twists and turns, I ended up at graduate school at Columbia University. And I don't know how many of you know the Upper West Side. It's one of my favorite places in New York. But they used to have these old bookstores that many of you may not even know about anymore. But these are the bookstores with the creaky wooden floors that you walk on, and you have to climb up a ladder to pull off that dusty esoteric book. And then you sit in these wonderful beanbag chairs, and I used to love to sit there all day long and read these books on what was considered very esoteric Eastern and Western spiritual disciplines. And that's what led me to forgiveness. And eventually, I found something that many of you know about, the Course in Miracles. And actually, I was going to Columbia and studying in the library while Bill Thetford and Helen Schuckman were actually scribing that book, for those of you who know that history. While I was studying the Course, I was also becoming very interested in foreign affairs. And it was the time of the Cold War, and I was very, very concerned about how we create the face of the enemy, how we learn to hate and to fear. And as I was thinking about these issues, I had the very good fortune of being invited to go to the former Soviet Union, to Odessa. And I spent 6 weeks there. And I had an extraordinary experience, and I developed a wonderful fondness for the Russian people. And I realized how easy it was to create the face of the enemy. And that now that I was in the Soviet Union, I could see this more. And as I got to know people there, we began to talk about this. And I realized that what we really needed to do was learn how to forgive ourselves and each other, because we pick up so much from our own societies. And so while I was in Russia, I had an incredible spiritual experience. And after that, I knew that when I came back to the States, I was not going to be working on a one-to-one capacity as a psychologist, but that my calling was to work with groups and to help them heal from the wounds of war. So when I came back home, I began to do research in the area of forgiveness and reconciliation. And I was very curious what was being taught, and I went into Washington, D.C. I was living in Baltimore at the time. And I started asking people in the Foreign Service, what are you doing in terms of forgiveness and foreign affairs? And they kind of looked at me like I was very strange, like an eye in the center of my head or something. But there was one ambassador who wasn't quite sure if I was either brilliant or crazy. And he said, well, here, let me invite you. There's a conference that's going to be held, and it's going to be for diplomats and people in foreign service and political scientists. And why don't you come and speak on forgiveness and international affairs? So being as naive as I was, I said yes, thinking I was going to find all this information out there about forgiveness and international affairs. There wasn't any information. And so I had to figure out what I was going to do really quick. And luckily for me, I came across a story. And it was a story about a woman named Iran Lore. And Iran grew up in France during World War I, and she worked for the resistance in World War II. She grew up to hate the Germans. When the war ended, she was invited to go to a place called Caux, Switzerland, to a conference there. And the purpose of the conference was to discuss how were they going to unite Europe. And she assumes that since it was at the end of the war, there weren't going to be any Germans there. But in fact, there were 150 Germans present. Yeah, she was quite surprised. And every time a German person got to speak, the French in particular would get up and leave. And as she was leaving, one of the ministers stopped her and said, "I give you a challenge. I would like to know what you would do for a united Europe." So she went to her room, and for 3.5 days she sat there and she thought about all the reasons why she should hate the Germans. And she had many. And then eventually she said to herself, "Is this hatred going to get me what I really want?" And she realized, of course, that this is not what she wanted to do for a united Europe. And so she came back and she spoke to the group. And she struggled very hard to forgive the Germans. But there was a whole host of experience happening. And all of a sudden, in her struggle and in her belief of forgiveness, she began to feel something that she knew came from somewhere beyond herself. And that power, whatever it was, gave her the ability to forgive when in her heart she knew it was humanly impossible to forgive. She felt the presence of a higher intervention which transformed her relationship with the Germans. And as this happened, it was as though she had an interior renovation where she needed no exterior explanation. And as she took that step, it was as though her heart just leapt over the fence when she experienced this outpouring of inexplicable love.